Hello. I've decided to do this in English. Oh, because it is much easier for me. So my name is Julien. Been doing Perl for, I don't know, it's probably also almost 20 years now, but about 4.5 years ago, I moved to the UK from Germany. And since then, my ability to speak German has deteriorated rapidly. So whenever I have to talk about work-related things, it is really hard to do that in German, and I just get stuck. And sometimes I involuntarily switch to English. Um, so I am sorry, but I have to do this in English, or we'll be here all day. Um, right. So, uh, I mean, I'm happy about that and grateful. Um, Right, so I'm gonna talk about GitHub workflows and how they can be used for your CPAN modules. So I'm gonna basically give an introduction to the Perl action ecosystem, and I'll explain what this means. I will base most of this on the LWP modules workflow and the family of modules within the LWP space, which I'm one of the maintainers of. Uh, so this relates a little bit to what Lee did yesterday, in as much as you talked about the stuff for deployment in a work context, and I'm talking about the testing aspect of it in a CPAN context. If you have questions, please keep them to the end. And let's jump right in. So GitHub workflows, you may have seen them in your GitHub accounts. They're mainly used to run tests, to create and to publish builds, to produce static content for GitHub pages, and for continuous development and continuous integration. We're going to focus on the test bit, although you could use it to upload to CPAN, but I haven't seen anyone do that. It should be fairly easy. We'll start with a bit of terminology. GitHub Actions with an S, that's the product name. So the whole thing within GitHub is called Actions. And there's like an Actions tab when you look at a repository and stuff like that. Then we've got events, which is when something happens in the repository, like someone sends a pull request or you push to a branch, stuff like that. That's an event that's used to trigger workflows. A workflow is a list of instructions. We could also say it's a bit like a class. We think about object-oriented programming. And then we have jobs, which is a single running instance of a specific workflow, which sounds a bit like an object. So whenever an event happens, a job gets triggered, and that job is like an incarnation of a workflow or a part of a workflow. And then a job is made up out of multiple actions, or one or more actions, which is like a single command. So it's a bit like a method in an object, which is based on a class. And then there are runners, which are the server processes to run the jobs. They're typically like containers, such as Docker, but you could make your own. I'm not going to talk about them at all today, because that doesn't really matter to testing CPAN modules. Why would I want to do that whole thing? Why do I want to use that? So obviously, you can run tests on lots of different platforms when someone submits a PR, which is quite cool. Like, I mean, there is CPAN testers, which is great, but there is a difference. When people submit tests to CPAN testers, that's really good for obscure platforms. We used to have a good sponsor in the German Perl community. The DATEV, they used to run this really obscure, I think, AIX platform, and they would always send tons of test reports, and they even had like their own CPAN testers running instance just to test that thing. Obviously, you can't do that on GitHub very easily. I suppose you could probably if you have your own runners, but no. What's much more interesting is you can catch breakage early. You can enforce Perl critic and Perl tidy for pull requests when you have new contributors, for example. You can find missing dependencies. That's a fun one, in particular in the LWP family. We had a bug report like that recently where we hadn't found it, and now we're gonna probably make a test to find them. And you can do things like catching backwards compatibility that's broken because, I don't know, someone introduced some code that doesn't work on a 5.8 Perl, but we've committed to supporting older Perls. And you can do all of this way before you actually ship to people. And like most of the people will have a reasonably normal setup, like Strawberry Perl, Ubuntu, macOS, just standard out of the box Perl. And you can just have those test automatically every time you push code, every time someone submits a pull request. and it just makes sure all your tests pass. And that seems like a very sensible thing to do. Like, you can run the tests locally on your machine. Yay, it worked on my machine. But you're not going to have 20 different Perl versions and 3 different operating systems. So it makes sense to do this, but in no way does it clash with CPAN testers, or does it try to replace CPAN testers. These are very different things. Let's look at the workflow. So this is a screenshot of a pull request in libw.perl, where if you are involved in that pull request and there are these kinds of checks, you will see this little green check mark after the workflow or after the job has run. It says, hooray, all of the checks have passed. Some of you might have noticed that. Some of you might be doing that already. We're going to explore how this gets there within the next few slides. So in that repository, there's a .github folder, not unlike the .git folder, which is hidden, and it contains a workflows folder. And I had to make that. And within that workflows folder, there can be one or more YAML files. So that you can have one workflow or several workflows. Each workflow lives in its own file. It's a YAML-based file structure, which has lots of good documentation on GitHub. And yeah, so whenever an event happens, an incarnation of that workflow gets triggered, and you can see those in the Actions tab at the top. So like next to the pull requests. So you click that, you get a list of all the actions. Like in the screenshot, we can see that there were, like the most recent one was a scheduled one. And then before that, at the bottom, we've got the one for this branch that we were just looking at, well this pull request, which got triggered because Olaf pushed code and created a pull request. And if we open that, we get this very cute graph that shows all of the different jobs within that workflow as like a little graph. So there's like see how well readable that is. So we've got like build distribution, and we've got coverage job, and then we've got several matrices of like a bunch of jobs for Ubuntu, a bunch of jobs for macOS, and a bunch of jobs for Windows. And you can then click and open those directly. But let's look at this first. So close-up view. We have the build distribution, and then the coverage job depends on that working. And then there's also the set of jobs for different Perl versions on a specific operating system, which also depends on building first. And if we go into one of these and look at that in detail, it looks like that. So these are all of the different actions in there. So it sets it up, it initializes the container. I'll talk about that a little bit more. And then it runs, it checks out the code, it runs the tests, it uploads an artifact. So this is the build job. So it's run the tests once to make the distribution, and then it's created a tarball, which it uploads into its own little like memory somewhere that's stored within GitHub Actions. And then it cleans up, and the next job can then download that artifact, unzip it, and therefore, rather than work from source, work on a finished distribution that's already been built in that build job, which could have been with Distiller in this case, for example. Yeah. Some of these actions that we see here, like the checkout and the upload artifact, are provided by GitHub. So they're just there. You can just use them. But there are a couple of others, like the one for running the test, which are made by people within the Perl community. So these actions are like a large amount of Node.js code mostly, and then some other stuff that you can like make it run. And yeah, there are a couple of different ones maintained by the Perl community, and that's really what I want to show you. If we deep dive into that workflow file, the slides, if you want to look at this more closely, are attached to the talk, so you can like follow along on your own if you want to. Then I've also linked to this specific file. So this is the top of that YAML file, which has a couple of meta information things on it. So this workflow runs whenever you push to any branch, or when a pull request gets created for any branch. Now this could say main or master, because we probably don't want pull requests to go onto my feature branch. If Rolf pushes makes a pull request to pull against my feature branch because he thinks I've done some crap work, and he wants to fix it before I've actually, thank you, sent it off to master, then he could do that, and it would actually run this. how useful that is, I'm not sure. I might change that. And then it can also be a schedule. So we've already learned how the cron jobs work. It supports that as well. But if you leave the code for too long, so if you don't actually push any changes for too long, GitHub on a free tier disables those cron jobs, unfortunately, and then they disappear. And there's a bug at the moment that disables the whole workflow. So then people send pull requests and you think, oh, everything is fine, but it hasn't actually run the tests. And then you introduce a bug into LWP, which I did last week. Yay. Because I allowed code to be merged that hadn't been tested because I didn't see that the tests didn't run. That was stupid. So we're going to take those schedules out, I think. Yeah, you can look at the full file, but we're going to go through parts of the files now. So next we have jobs. This is the build job, or part of it. Has a name, and then it says runs on. So this is the operating system it runs on. It's Ubuntu 20.04, but it uses a container, and that's in yellow here. So that points to a Docker container that is maintained by a group of Perl people, and it lives in GitHub under the Perl group, which I think also owns the actual Perl source code. It'll set up a Docker container that has Perl 534 in it. And that specific Docker container comes with lots of utilities and stuff pre-installed for distribution testing and bundling, which is pretty cool. Well, and then we check stuff out. And so imagine this all to be one long file, obviously. Then we run tests. We can set some environment variables. And then we just, this run action just executes a shell command. So it runs a program called upgrade Perl helpers, and then another program called auto build and test dist, which both of these come with this Docker container. So someone has written these. They install all the helpers and get them onto the newest versions. And then they run distiller to build the distribution. That spits out a tarball, and then it uses the upload artifact action to put the tarball into the cache upload space thing that hides it away for later use. Which brings us to the test job. So I've skipped the coverage job, and we're going to the test job. This is the Ubuntu one, which depends on the build job. That's why it says needs there. It also runs on a Ubuntu 20.04, and then it uses a strategy, which is called matrix. So you can combine lots of different variables. And in this case, we've made up two variables named operating system and Perl version. Both of those have to be arrays. Tina Pro will have an opinion on me using both versions of writing an array in the same file right next to each other, above the yellow. Sorry, I caught you by surprise. You just got back. Yeah, so the Perl versions for this Linux test, they're like basically everything from 5.8 to 5.34. In the original file, they're all written out by hand. There isn't currently a good way of having that pull in from somewhere else, but that would be quite useful. And then in this case, the operating system is only the one value, which is Ubuntu 20.04. I'm just going to pause for a moment for everyone who's just come in to settle.
Is it possible to actually
So Paul hasn't listened to me and interrupted me to ask a question, although I said questions at the end. Now, Paul has asked if it would be possible to make a list of Perl versions and pull those in. I have thought about that. I have not found a reasonable good answer yet. I think you could make an action that someone could load, which would then be in like the list of stuff that it does, and that can set an environment variable, and then you could use that environment variable, but I don't know how to get it into this bit because it's higher up than the actual job, like the actual job steps. So I tried to find out how this works. I haven't found a good answer for it yet. It might not be possible. But it would be cool to have this maintained externally. I have thought about it before. It's like, yeah, it makes sense. You just do one thing and it updates all of your things at once rather than you have to go and update all of the repositories. But we already had to do this back when it was Travis. So, yeah. So back to this matrix. Basically, it will do all of the combinations of all of the variables you put in there. And as I said, we've just made up the names OS and Perl version here. They could be foo and bar as well. They would just do them. Like it's just basically all pass testing. And then we use the fail fast strategy. So if one of those fails, the jobs, like the test jobs fail, so basically one of the action steps returns an exit error code, it'll make all of those jobs that are derived from that particular matrix fail, because there's no point in using up resources. Right. So let's look at the next bit. I hope this is readable. Looks reasonably large. So we can see the yellow bits on the first, well, on the name of the job, actually. So the name of the job is Perl, and then we insert a variable, matrix.perl version, which could be 5.8 or 5.34, on matrix.os, which is always going to be Ubuntu 20.04 in this case. And then we execute a bunch of steps. So the first step pulls in a custom action that someone has made whose name is Shogo82148. And that basically installs a Perl, or rather pulls in a pre-compiled Perl, and sets it up. And it takes an argument, which is the matrix Perl version again. You may have noticed there is no container setting in this job, because we don't want the Perl Docker container, because that only works on Linux, but we're going to do Linux, Mac, and Windows in 3 different bits. And also we don't want to build, we want to run tests, and we're just going to download the artifact that we've created, so the bundle that we've created with Distiller in the previous step. So we're just using a plain Ubuntu, and then we're dumping a pre-compiled Perl into it. In the next step, as I said, we download the artifact and unpack it. Then we use Perl Actions install with CPM. So that's another different custom action that the community has built. There are a couple of those, like there's CPM, there's CPAN, and I think there's at least one other, which I cannot remember the name of. And we tell it use the CPAN file, which we've just unpacked with the download artifact action. And we give it a couple of arguments, like install the suggestions, install the recommendations, install the test dependencies. So it goes and does lots of CPM, gets all of the dependencies for LWP. Then we have to install sendmail, because the LWP tests test, I think it's the URI for mail. So there's something SMTP, maybe it's the SMTP transport. So it needs to send an email, so it needs sendmail. So that's just like a shell action. And then we run proof. Really simple, proof minus LR T. And we set environment variables for that specific thing. It doesn't really matter what the test runs, but you can do all of these different sort of like ways to run commands. The important thing is the install with CPM and the setting up the Perl, which we will look at in a minute. Now we're going to look at the same thing for Mac and Windows. So I've skipped most of it, but the difference is here runs on macOS and runs on Windows. Both of them fail fast, but the Perl versions are interesting. So for macOS, you can have all the Perls, but Windows is Strawberry Perl, and we can't have really old Strawberry Perls for reasons I do not recall for LWP. I believe they don't exist, or there is a dependency thing where like something doesn't work on older Windows Perls. I do not remember, but it only goes to 5.30, which is because the people who do Strawberry Perl have disappeared, I believe. So there is no newer build than 5.30, which is a bit of a shame. So we can't test those. Yeah, I've skipped the steps. They look more or less the same, although they're not exactly the same. If in your distribution you only want to test Perl versions that work on all 3 operating systems and all of your steps are the same, you could use a single job spec and combine the matrix and say OS is actually a list, macOS latest, Windows latest, Linux latest, and Perl version is a list, and then the matrix will do all combinations of all of them with just a single little bit of code. I will try to simplify this at the Toolchain Summit in April. So that's one of the things I plan to do with LWP there, to make all of this easier to read. In the meantime, it is a very long file that you can find at that URL there. Now, it's not really a live demo, but it is. I am going to show you the different things I talked about. So this is the Docker container. It lives in this repository. and it brings a whole bunch of things that get pre-installed, such as Aspel, CPAN minus, CPM, devel cover, Distzilla, various testing modules. Here's a full list here. And then if you have 5.10, it also gives you code tidy all and test vars. And on 5.12, it gives you pod readme. And in 5.14, it gives you more Distzilla with a bunch of author bundles. And then there's a list of all of the different Perl versions you can support for that Docker container. So there's 5.8 all the way through 5.36 at the moment, and the devel, which is that the bleed branch, or is devel a different one? Oh, no, it might be the most recent uneven subversion. So it would be 5.37.4 or 5 is the current one? 9 already. Oh, there. 5.37.8, for example. Yeah. So they're all built on Buster, which is Debian, I think. Yeah, and here's an example of how to use them, how to use it, to integrate it. And then there are a bunch of helper scripts, which are in this repository. I'm not going to click on that. You can read it yourself. There are more examples. There's a, maybe we could see if we could link my blog post into this. Yeah, lots of information. Then we have the, oops, Perl testers. So this is the other thing I mentioned. This is one of the actions, which brings a whole bunch of like automatically build-in test distribution, just build the distribution, install dependencies with CPAN, install build dependencies and dependencies, test the distribution and upgrade. So these are all quite useful because they mean they have no documentation. That's a shame. You have to read the code. They mean you can yeah, use them in your stuff. And then finally there is Shogo stuff, which is separate and just works on a standard Ubuntu, where you tell it which Perl version you want and it gives you a Perl, and that is quite cool. And then here's an example for how to use that in matrix testing or with Strawberry. So lots of good stuff to read. If you want a more in-depth look at this, I wrote a blog post about this, which is very long and has a very good explanation of how this works, which I have linked in the slides. And I am going to find the slides. There we go. If you have any questions, I have no time left, so you have to ask me in the break. Thank you very much. Seriously though, if there are any questions, I think we do have a bit of time. You'll just get less coffee. Paul, yeah.
Oh. Can you use chocolate?
I do not know what this is.
This chocolate window.
Okay, so he asked, can we use chocolatey instead of strawberry Perl? I don't know what chocolatey is. I thought it's an installer for things. I do not know. I mean, you could make your own thing. More questions? Rolf?
Little correction. I have strawberry 32 installed, so it exists.
Okay, so Rolf says strawberry 532 exists. It's possible that you built it yourself?
Nope.
No. Maybe they have now done it.
The last regular one.
Maybe they've done it, or maybe something else was wrong. But I remember we had to take the most recent versions out because they blew up, and then we had to fix that. But certainly there is no 534 for strawberry.
Yeah.
Yeah. Any other questions? Just let me ask a question. How many of you have used this stuff before? Power, okay, a couple, 5, 6, 7 people. And are you using these tools, or did you roll your own like when the GitHub Actions started? So and so, okay. Right. Great. Thank you very much for your attention.